There are books that inform, books that challenge, and then, rarely, books that restructure the very ground you stand on. Iain McGilchrist's The Master and His Emissary, The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World belongs to that third category. Published in 2009 and expanded in a new edition in 2019, this is the work of a man who spent 20 years at the intersection of neuroscience, philosophy, literature, and cultural history. A former Oxford literary scholar who retrained as a psychiatrist and who brought both halves of that unusual life to bear on a single enormous question. What does the structure of the human brain reveal about the structure of Western civilization? McGilchrist's answer is as sweeping as it is precise. The brain is divided into two hemispheres, and those hemispheres do not simply divide up tasks between them. They embody two fundamentally different relationships to the world. The right hemisphere knows the world as living, embodied, interconnected, always more than it can say. The left hemisphere grasps the world by taking it apart, fixing it, categorizing it, rendering it manipulable. Both are necessary. But the history of the West, McGilchrist argues, is the history of those two modes of being falling into conflict, and of the left hemisphere's slow, dangerous victory. This is a summary of that argument. It cannot replace the original, but it can open the door. McGilchrist begins by refusing the commonplace. Everyone has heard that the left brain is logical and the right brain is creative, a folk psychology so simplified as to be nearly useless. He dismantles this cartoon version not to dismiss the science of hemispheric difference, but to replace it with something far more interesting and far more disturbing. The two hemispheres do not divide up faculties. They divide up ways of being. The question is not what each hemisphere does, but what kind of world each hemisphere inhabits. And the answer to that question runs far deeper than any textbook account of brain lateralization has suggested. The asymmetry begins in biology and extends into everything. McGilchrist shows that the brain's division is not accidental or vestigial. It is ancient, conserved across species, and functionally essential. Birds use their two hemispheres simultaneously, but for completely different purposes. The right eye and left hemisphere attend to the detail directly in front of them, the seed, the predator, while the left eye and right hemisphere scan the wider world for context and connection. The divided brain is not a human curiosity. It is the solution evolution arrived at for a deep structural problem: how to attend to focused, manipulable detail and to open, relational context at the same time. You cannot do both with the same cognitive apparatus. What evolution gave us was two different kinds of attention operating in parallel. And the price of that gift is the permanent possibility of conflict between them. The asymmetry is real, it is meaningful, and it is the key to everything that follows. What the two hemispheres actually do, when you move beyond caricature, is one of the most genuinely surprising things in this book, and McGilchrist spends considerable effort getting it right. The left hemisphere's world is explicit, fixed, decontextualized. It deals in categories, representations, and tools. It knows things by taking them apart and abstracting from them. It is drawn to the mechanical, the repeatable, the already known. It is confident and voluble. The right hemisphere's world is implicit, living, contextual. It apprehends things in their wholeness before it can analyze them. It is attuned to the new, the ambiguous, the emotionally resonant, the embodied. It is less certain and harder to articulate, not because it knows less, but because what it knows resists the kind of explicit verbal packaging the left hemisphere prefers. This distinction runs through everything: attention, perception, memory, emotion, empathy, self-awareness, moral judgment. The right hemisphere sustains a broader, more vigilant attention to the world as it actually is. The left hemisphere narrows attention to what it has already decided to look for. The right hemisphere recognizes faces, music, metaphor, and context. The left hemisphere processes language's denotative content, sequences, and explicit rules. Crucially, and this is where McGilchrist's argument begins to acquire its weight, the right hemisphere knows that there is always more than it can say, while the left hemisphere tends to mistake its own map for the territory. The left hemisphere is the hemisphere that produces certainty. The right hemisphere is the hemisphere that knows how uncertain everything really is. Language and music become, in McGilchrist's hands, a lens through which the two hemispheres reveal their deepest difference. Language, commonly assigned to the left hemisphere, turns out to be more complicated than that. The left hemisphere handles language's formal, denotative, grammatical aspects, the mechanics of the code. But the right hemisphere is responsible for everything that makes language more than a code: metaphor, irony, humor, the emotional tone of speech, the implicit meanings carried in context and relationship. Music, meanwhile, is not the opposite of language. It is something older, more primal, and more universal. McGilchrist suggests that language grew out of music, not the other way around, that the emotional and relational dimensions of human communication came first, and that grammar and explicit denotation developed later as a kind of precision tool, built on top of that older expressive substrate. This matters enormously for understanding what gets lost when the left hemisphere's style of cognition dominates. It is not merely poetry that suffers. It is the capacity to understand implication, to hear what is not said, to grasp the whole before attending to the parts. The left hemisphere literalizes. It turns metaphor into statement and music into noise. When it dominates, language becomes more precise in one register and catastrophically less adequate in all the others. McGilchrist is not making a sentimental case for feeling overthinking. He is making a structural argument. The kind of knowledge that the right hemisphere underwrites is irreplaceable, and its eclipse does not produce greater clarity. It produces a kind of sophisticated blindness. The nature of the two worlds each hemisphere inhabits is not just a neurological fact. It is a philosophical difference about what reality is and how it can be known. McGilchrist draws on an extraordinary range of sources: phenomenology, especially Heidegger and Husserl, the philosophy of science, the history of art, Eastern philosophical traditions. What emerges is a portrait of the left hemisphere as constitutively unable to understand what the right hemisphere knows, not because the left hemisphere is stupid, but because the kind of thing the right hemisphere knows cannot be captured by the left hemisphere's preferred methods of categorization and explicit representation. The right hemisphere's world is relational, flowing, always already more than any description of it. It knows the self as embodied and embedded in a world it did not create. It knows other people as genuinely other, not as representations of persons, but as persons. It knows time as duration, as lived experience, not as a sequence of measurable units. The left hemisphere's world, by contrast, is made up of fixed separable entities that can be counted, measured, and manipulated. The left hemisphere is not wrong about what it sees. It simply cannot see most of what is there. And crucially, because the left hemisphere's output is explicit and articulable, it tends to mistake the articulable for the real. The implicit, the contextual, the living, whatever cannot be pinned down and named, tends to be dismissed by the left hemisphere as vague, subjective, or unreal. This is not a small philosophical error. It is the template for the civilization scale mistake McGilchrist is about to document. The right hemisphere is not, McGilchrist insists, merely the creative hemisphere or the emotional hemisphere. It is the grounding hemisphere. It is the one that first apprehends reality, that opens to the world before the left hemisphere can narrow and fix it. In healthy cognition, the right hemisphere is the master. It receives the world in its fullness, passes material to the left hemisphere for the focused attention and explicit processing that certain tasks require, and then, this is the crucial step, the output of the left hemisphere is returned to the right hemisphere to be reintegrated into living understanding. The left hemisphere is the emissary, a servant of extraordinary competence, sent out to accomplish specific tasks, but always supposed to return to the master who sent it. McGilchrist draws on the parable attributed to Nietzsche, from which the book takes its title, of a wise spiritual master who governs a territory through emissaries. One emissary grows so confident in his own judgment, so convinced by his own success at administration, that he gradually believes he understands better than the master he serves. He begins to act on his own authority. The territory eventually falls. The right hemisphere is the master. The left hemisphere is the emissary that has begun to usurp the throne. In the healthy individual and in healthy culture, this usurpation is held in check. The question the book's second half asks with increasing urgency, is what happens when it is not. Culture, McGilchrist argues, is not simply something the brain produces. It feeds back into the brain, shaping the cognitive dispositions of entire civilizations across generations. This is the bridge between the neuroscience of Part 1 and the cultural history of Part 2. Imitation is the mechanism. Human beings do not simply copy behaviors, they absorb entire ways of attending to the world. A culture that rewards left hemisphere cognitive styles, precision, explicit analysis, manipulation of abstraction, will gradually train its members to attend to the world in a left hemisphere way. This can compound over generations. The left hemisphere's emissary, once it captures the institutions and prestige structures of a civilization, begins to select for itself. This is not biological determinism. McGilchrist is not arguing that genes change. He is arguing that neuroplasticity, the brain's extraordinary capacity to reshape itself in response to how it is used, means that sustained cultural pressure toward one mode of attention has real cognitive consequences. The civilizations and periods he is about to examine are not metaphors for brain states. They are periods in which particular balances of hemispheric dominance found expression in art, philosophy, religion, and politics. And those expressions, in turn, reinforced the cognitive dispositions that generated them. History and neuroscience are, in this book, looking at the same phenomenon from different angles. The ancient Greek and Roman worlds are where McGilchrist first traces his thesis in cultural history, and the picture is more complex and more interesting than simple decline narratives allow. Pre-Socratic philosophy, at its best, reflected a right hemisphere openness to paradox, to becoming rather than being, to the world as fundamentally alive and self-organizing. Heraclitus understood that opposites are held together by a deeper unity, the logos, and that reality is inherently dynamic, never fixed. The tragic drama of Athens grasped both the necessity of limits and the terrible cost of ignoring the irrational, the embodied, the non-rational dimensions of human life. Roman culture at its peak combined civic order with genuine openness to the organic. The law rooted in particular human experience, the religious life attending to the sacred, in the local and the traditional. But already in the development of Platonic philosophy, McGilchrist sees the beginning of a dangerous abstraction, the devaluation of the sensory world in favor of a realm of pure, fixed, explicit forms. Plato is not the villain, his work contains genuine wisdom, but the trajectory his philosophy inaugurates moves toward exactly the kind of disembodied, ahistorical, explicit representation prioritizing worldview that the left hemisphere prefers. Roman culture, in its late imperial phase, shows the same pattern, an increasing rigidity, bureaucratic abstraction, loss of the organic and the locally rooted. What begins as the precision of the emissary gradually hardens into the tyranny of the bureaucrat. The Renaissance represents, for McGilchrist, one of the great recoveries of right hemisphere integration in Western history, a period in which depth returned to vision, embodiment returned to art, and particularity returned to thought. The recovery of classical sources unleashed a new attentiveness to the actual human face, the actual human body, the landscape as something lived in rather than merely schematized. The painters of the Renaissance, Leonardo above all, exemplify the kind of cognition McGilchrist most prizes, a simultaneous hold on the precise and the contextual, the scientific and the expressive, the universal and the particular. But the Reformation, unfolding in parallel, moves in the opposite direction. The Protestant impulse, however genuine its spiritual motivations, strips away the embodied, the iconic, the liturgical, all the ways in which the right hemisphere's mode of knowing had been embedded in religious practice. The image is suspect, the sacrament is dematerialized, the intermediary world between the purely material and the purely abstract is abolished. What remains is text, proposition, and the individual conscience stripped of the mediation of community and tradition. This is not to say the Reformation was simply wrong. It corrected real abuses and recovered real truths. But its cognitive direction, McGilchrist argues, tilted toward the explicit, the propositional, and the individually self-sufficient. Precisely the left hemisphere's preferred arrangement. The Enlightenment is where the tilt becomes a lean and the lean becomes a fall. The 18th century produced extraordinary minds and genuine advances in human understanding. Newton, Locke, Voltaire, Hume. But the dominant spirit of the age elevated one kind of knowing to the status of the only legitimate kind. Reason, understood as explicit, deductive, and inductive inference, became the criterion of truth. Everything that could not be rendered as explicit argument was suspect. Tradition, revelation, embodied custom, aesthetic intuition, the authority of the particular and the local. The social contract theories that flourished in this period are, for McGilchrist, paradigmatically left hemisphere constructions. They begin with abstract individuals who enter into explicit arrangements rather than with actual human beings embedded in communities, histories, and attachments they did not choose and could not articulate. The consequences are visible not only in philosophy, but in architecture, garden design, music, and the general texture of cultural life. The formal garden replaces the living landscape. The symmetrical facade replaces the organically accumulated building. The explicitly rational replaces the implicitly wise. McGilchrist is careful here. He is not defending superstition or irrationality. He is insisting that there is a kind of wisdom that precedes explicit reasoning, that is not reducible to it, and that is necessary to it. The right hemisphere's hold on the living, contextual, relational real. When Enlightenment rationalism dismisses this, it does not become more rational. It becomes rational in a narrower sense and deluded in a deeper one. Romanticism arrives as a corrective, a genuine, anguished reaching back toward the right hemisphere's world by artists and thinkers who felt the loss of depth, connection, and organic life that the Enlightenment's rationalism had produced. Wordsworth hears in nature something more than matter. Keats suspects that beauty and truth are not opposed. Schelling and later German idealism attempt to recover the organic unity of subject and object that the Cartesian split had sundered. McGilchrist takes Romanticism seriously, not as sentimental nostalgia, but as a genuine cognitive correction, a recovery of the implicit, the embodied, the contextual. But the Industrial Revolution was doing in material life precisely what Enlightenment rationalism had done in intellectual life, replacing the living with the mechanical, the organic with the repeatable, the rooted with the mobile. The factory system extracted labor from the embedded rhythms of agricultural and artisanal life and organized it according to the clock, the ledger, and the efficiency principle. McGilchrist does not deny the material gains. He insists on the cognitive and spiritual costs, the loss of a relationship to work as meaningful, to place as home, to community as given rather than chosen. The Romantic poets and the factory system are, for him, two simultaneous responses to the same underlying shift, one a cry of protest, the other a triumphant march. The modern and postmodern worlds are where McGilchrist's diagnosis becomes most urgent and, for some readers, most controversial. Modernity completes the left hemisphere's institutional capture. Science becomes scientism, the only legitimate form of inquiry. The quantifiable becomes the real, the manageable becomes the valuable. Architecture turns from the organic to the abstract, glass and steel, and the clean erasure of history. Art embraces the fragmentary, the ironic, and the deliberately meaningless, not as a tragic commentary on loss, but as an aesthetic program. The individual becomes a self-constructing project, unrooted in tradition, nature, or community. Postmodernism is, for McGilchrist, the paradoxical final stage. The left hemisphere has become so dominant that it has begun to consume its own foundations. It deconstructs the very notion of truth, turning everything into power, narrative, and social construction. And in doing so, it actually enacts the left hemisphere's deepest error, its tendency to mistake its own representations for reality, and then, finding only representations, to conclude that reality is nowhere. The result is a world that is simultaneously hyper-rationalist in its bureaucratic and technological operations and radically relativist in its self-understanding, a combination that is not the sophisticated synthesis it appears, but the natural endpoint of a civilization that has lost the right hemisphere's grounding in reality, as given, prior, and objective. McGilchrist's conclusion is called The Master Betrayed, and it earns its title. He surveys the features of a civilization in which the left hemisphere has usurped the master's place. The prevalence of bureaucratic procedure over judgment, of metric over meaning, of the virtual over the actual, of explicit rule over tacit wisdom, of rights language over obligation language, of the constructed self over the given self. This is not dystopian fantasy. It is the phenomenology of ordinary life in the contemporary West, described with the precision of a clinician who knows exactly what he is seeing. McGilchrist's deepest worry is that the condition is self-reinforcing. A culture dominated by left hemisphere cognition will produce institutions, education systems, media environments, and forms of economic organization that reward left hemisphere styles of attention and penalize right hemisphere ones, which in turn shapes the cognitive dispositions of the next generation. He is not without hope. Moments of recovery have happened before. The Renaissance was a recovery. The Romantic movement was a partial recovery. But each time the corrective ran its course, the underlying dynamic reasserted itself, pushed forward now by technological systems of extraordinary power that embody the left hemisphere's values at civilizational scale. Few books in recent memory deserve the word important as unambiguously as this one. McGilchrist is not offering a self-help framework, a political manifesto, or a spiritual program. He is doing something rarer, describing, with rigorous interdisciplinary care, a fundamental disorder in the Western mind, its progressive loss of the capacity to attend to reality as it actually is, in all its ambiguity, depth, and irreducibility. Read through the lens of the perennial tradition, the conviction that truth is real, the person is made for more than efficiency, and the contemplative life is not a luxury but a necessity. The book reads as a precise secular diagnosis of what happens to a civilization that forgets that the mind is more than a calculating machine, and the world is more than what calculation can touch. The title's parable is not merely a metaphor. It is a warning about what happens when the servant mistakes himself for the master, and what must be recovered if the civilization is to find its way back. Read this book. Read it slowly, reread it, argue with it. It will change the way you hear a conversation, walk through a city, understand a news cycle, or feel the absence of something you could not previously name. Iain McGilchrist has given the West a mirror, and the reflection is uncomfortable enough to be worth every word.